Good morning. This sermon is a sermon for Sunday, June 6th, 2026, the second Sunday after the Feast of the Epiphany. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I wonder if you've ever found yourself wondering about a decision you made and trying to guess at how your life might have been different if you'd made a different one. What if I'd picked my second choice university? What if I'd taken that job in that other city? What if I'd married the first guy who proposed? What if I'd called the doctor sooner? There are a couple of turning points in my life that I find I sometimes let myself muse on in this way. Things like, what would my life be like if I'd put off going to seminary in my 20s? Would I have gotten there by now? Would I have found some other career that would have taken over? Would I be off enjoying weekends instead of writing sermons on Saturday nights and working on Sundays? The reality is that for most of the decisions I've made, and this is probably true for you as well, a bunch of just other decisions then branched off. So even when my brain tries to play those scenarios out, it becomes a little impossible. Especially because I know that some big decisions felt big at the time and did, in fact, really make a big difference. But some felt small and inconsequential, and it was only later that I realized how much they changed things. I got started musing on this because I hadn't really realized that the magnet I had on my fridge for years was a quote of Psalm 33:10. The Lord frustrates the plans of the people, is how our psalm describes it. My magnet said, "We plan, God laughs." I liked it because of all the times when I made a decision that I anticipated would result in one thing, only to find that it resulted in something else. Not always negatively, but maybe not always how I had expected things to be. I always saw the message of that magnet as one about a loving, benevolent God who knows what that our desire to control our own futures hardly ever works out, but lets us do it anyway and waits patiently for us to realize that God's been right all along. But I had at least one conversation about it with someone who saw it as suggesting more of a mean-spirited God, one who laughs at us while we waste our time foolishly pretending that we're in charge. Neither of which is what the psalmist is trying to say about God. The psalm is about praising God for creation and acknowledging the ways in which God's wisdom and counsel and plans are greater than even the very best of humanity. In creation, we see the righteousness and justice and steadfast love of the Creator. And at the end of the day, how we react to God as Creator, as one who laughs with or at us, says a lot about how we understand the nature of God. So I want to pick out some things from our readings this morning that tell us about the nature of God. In Genesis, we hear some of the story of Abraham and Sarah and the trials they go through to follow God. For those of us who are familiar with this story, we might know it to be a story about hope and faithfulness. God promises Abraham and Sarah this legacy as the ancestors of many nations. But then they spend years and years and years unable to have a child at all. Their ability to hold on to this promise, to have faith, and to hold on to this hope falters along the way. And even so, in the long run, God does fulfill the promise that they will be blessed so that they can be a blessing to the world. Their descendants really are as numerous as the stars. Their story is told and retold to this very day in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam. So we turn to this story when we want to draw attention to the ways in which God is faithful to God's promises. We can't always see the path. Sarah gives up on this promise so thoroughly that she laughs when angels promise her a child in her old age. She laughs at God's plan. Even so, God carries through. Years later, Paul suggests that God carries through for Abraham and Sarah because they remained faithful. And if that's the case, then faithfulness can't just mean sort of believing blindly that God will work miracles, which might be a kind of definition that you've encountered over your life as a Christian. Maybe not something someone said aloud, but something that sort of underpinned an idea about how faith should work. That we should just have it and kind of believe in God without ever really doubting or questioning or laughing at the promises and plans. And if that's not what faith is, what is it? What is faithfulness? What does it mean for us to be faithful? In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus seems to tie faithfulness to mercy and what we might call an audacious hope. To understand how audacious the hope is in today's readings, we need to make sure we understand something about ancient Jewish life in the time of Jesus. At the time of Jesus, ancient Judaism divided the world into things that were clean and things that were unclean. Religious studies scholars might have said things that were sacred and things that were profane. Not only is there this kind of hard divide, there's also a sense that the profane things can kind of infect sacred things. Being too close to the unclean can dirty the clean. So, most religious traditions that make this kind of divide have a variety of rules that are meant to keep the clean away from the unclean. Now, most religious traditions that make this divide also have a way of bringing someone who has become profane back into a state of sacredness to clean something that's become unclean. But those rituals are often complex enough that you don't want to have to do them all the time. So, here are some things that are unclean in this story that we got from the Gospel of Matthew. A woman while bleeding, and blood more generally, dead bodies, and sinners. Among the worst sort of sinners in the Gospel of Matthew are tax collectors. They were agents of the oppressive Roman Empire. They were frequently in a position to make up the difference between what they were paid and what they felt they should be paid by overcharging on taxes, both because they needed to and because, like many who are given access to smallish bits of power, they were inclined to using it arbitrarily. There was no centralized tax rates, nor government bodies to appeal to if the tax collector simply decided to demand an exorbitant amount. So when Jesus calls Matthew the tax collector into the inner circle of his disciples, he really is making a statement that begins to suggest that the power over what is sacred and what is profane maybe doesn't reside in human beings at all. And he's making a statement that isn't just hard for the ancient Jewish religious leaders to handle, but one that would have been hard for the disciples to handle too. And one that, if we're honest, is still sometimes hard for us to handle. And almost as if the author of the Gospel of Matthew understands how hard this will be, the narrative moves immediately into two stories of healing. Jesus hangs out with tax collectors. Boom, Jesus is in situations where he gets to heal people. The first is a girl who has just died. And then on his way to her, Jesus has an encounter with a woman with a 12-year-long period. Now, she is a biblical character that I really wish the Gospels had taken the time to name because she's spectacular. She's just as ostracized as Matthew, and undoubtedly fighting the physical impacts of whatever has caused this nonstop bleeding. And while Matthew is basically just sitting about doing his job when Jesus calls him, this woman does not wait for an invitation. She makes her way through the crowd with the hope and faith that the nature of God is mercy and healing. And she reaches out and touches Jesus and makes him unclean by association. You can almost hear in the text how offended the disciples must have been on behalf of Jesus, and how much they must have anticipated that Jesus would give this woman a dressing down. His response that is mercy and healing, that is the very heart of God, must have stunned them a little. First Matthew, and now this woman. What did they sign up for? But they continue on their way, and at the home of this leader who has approached Jesus and said, "Come, my child has died. If you come, you can make it better." Jesus does not just speak words of healing, but he reaches out and he touches this child. He took her by the hand. And so if Jesus wasn't already unclean from hanging out with a tax collector and from being touched by a woman on her period, he's now unclean from touching a dead body. No wonder a report of all this spread throughout the district. You can imagine that that report was both amazed and also appalled. So, in these two healings, faith is not just a belief that Jesus can work miraculous healings, although it's that. It's also a kind of audacious willingness to move across social and religious barriers, to seek that which gives life, to trust in Jesus precisely because he eats with sinners and tax collectors, not despite it. Now, I'm recording this sermon quite a bit later than normal. I almost always do it on Saturday evening because it tends to take all week for the readings to really marinate enough for me to figure out what to say. But it's later in the evening than is my norm. And one of the reasons for this is because when I stopped for late dinner, I thought I would just watch a little bit of TV. So I put on a Netflix documentary, thinking it'd be easy to stop, but then I ended up watching the full episode. It was a documentary called Chef's Table, and in this particular episode, a chef, a guy named Evan Funke, describes his vocation for making pasta by hand. And part of what was so interesting that I couldn't turn it off was the journey he went on. As a kid, he had the kind of loving parents who promised to be proud of him no matter what he did for work, which ironically left him somewhat adrift and a little lost. If everything was fine, what on earth was for him? And then he found cooking and began to realize that maybe this was for him. And then he found himself in Italy learning how to hand shape pastas and discovered where his passion and love and skill and capacity all came together. But the journey took a turn when his first restaurant back in the US went bankrupt because he knew pasta, but he did not know how to run a restaurant. And what really struck me in how he told his story was that when he realized his ignorance had consequences, he buckled down and learned how to run a business with the same level of intensity that he had gone to Italy to learn how to shape pasta. What that made me think about in these stories in the Gospel of Matthew and in the story of Abraham and Sarah is about how having faith, how trusting in God does not eliminate the need for action. The woman who reaches out to Jesus reached out. She takes action. The leader who sought Jesus out asks for his help for a child who has already died. Even Matthew gets up and follows Jesus as if he had nothing to lose. In these stories, we see a God whose nature is steadfast love, mercy, and faithfulness. And we're invited to share that nature, to cross the barriers and boundaries we create for ourselves in order to love more fully, to respond more faithfully. And if some of the time, maybe a lot of the time, that means that the plans we make for our own lives turn out completely differently than we anticipate, well, then perhaps it's time to learn something new. Perhaps it's time for us to learn to laugh with God. Amen.